Avery decided to ruin her life at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, surrounded by the muted clinking of crystal and the scent of money so old it had turned to dust. The air in the Skyview Lounge, perched atop Seoul's tallest testament to commerce, was thin and cold, just like the future her father had so meticulously arranged for her. Below, the city sprawled out like a web of captured starlight, each pinprick of light a life being lived with a freedom she could only imagine. Her own life was a gilded cage, and the lock was about to be turned for good. She smoothed the fine wool of her beige dress, a placid color for a sacrificial lamb, and pulled her dark coat tighter around her shoulders, a flimsy armor against the inevitable. Her father, Ambassador Davies, was across the room, his laughter a booming instrument of diplomacy as he glad-handed the man whose son she was to be engaged to within the hour. It was a merger, not a marriage. Her 20 years of existence were to be collateral for a transatlantic shipping deal. She felt a cold, sharp clarity pierce through the fog of her despair. She would not be a contract. She would not be a clause. She would be a catastrophe. Her eyes fixed on the grand, revolving doors of the lounge, a slow-moving vortex of Seoul's elite. A vow formed on her lips, silent but absolute, a prayer to any god of chaos that might be listening. The next man who walks through that door, she promised the universe, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, I will ask him to marry me. And I will not take no for an answer. It was a declaration of war disguised as a surrender, an act of self-destruction that felt, terrifyingly, like the only way to save herself. The decision settled not with peace, but with the thrilling, sickening plunge of a free fall. She was letting go of the gilded ledge, plummeting toward an unknown ground, armed with nothing but the sheer, unadulterated power of a single, ruinous yes. The polished brass doors revolved with a silent, heavy grace, and a man stepped through, pausing for a moment, as if to let the opulent atmosphere of the lounge wash over him. He did not belong. It was not in his clothes, which were simple, a dark, well-tailored suit that eschewed brand recognition for perfect form, but in his stillness. While everyone else in the room postured and performed, he simply was. He stood alone, an island of quiet intensity in a sea of performative chatter. His presence was a void that drew all the noise and light into it, leaving a trail of hushed whispers. His hair was black as polished ink, his features sharp, carved from some harder, more resilient material than the soft men who populated this world. But it was his eyes that held Avery captive. They were dark and deep, and as they swept the room, they seemed to absorb everything without reflecting anything back. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little, or perhaps felt everything so deeply he had to build a fortress around his soul. Avery's breath caught. He was not handsome in the way her father's world defined it. There was no easy charm, no practiced smile. There was only a profound, almost dangerous gravity. This was not a man who would be a simple inconvenience to her father. He would be an impossibility, a variable for which there was no calculation. He was the embodiment of the chaos she had prayed for. He moved toward the bar, his walk fluid and silent, and took a seat at the far end, away from the clusters of networking executives. He ordered a drink with a low murmur to the bartender and then turned his gaze to the city lights beyond the glass, his profile a stark, lonely silhouette against the glittering expanse of Seoul. Avery felt the pull of her vow, a physical thing yanking her from her seat. This was it. The moment her carefully constructed life would shatter. Her father was still laughing, oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring in his daughter's heart. She rose, her legs unsteady, the beige dress suddenly feeling like a costume for a role she refused to play. She was no longer Ambassador Davies' daughter. She was just a girl walking toward a stranger, about to ask him to set her world on fire. Avery approached the bar, the sound of her own heartbeat a deafening drum in her ears. She stopped beside his stool, her shadow falling over the polished mahogany. He didn't look at her immediately, his attention still fixed on the sprawling city below, as if counting the lights. She waited, gathering the frayed ends of her courage. When he finally turned his head, His dark eyes met hers with an unnerving lack of surprise, as if he had been expecting her. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a calm, analytical curiosity. He looked her over once, the expensive dress, the panicked flicker in her eyes, the desperate set of her jaw, and seemed to file the information away. "Can I help you?" His voice was low and steady, a gravelly timbre that held no trace of an accent she could place, just a clean, precise articulation of the English words. Her own voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper she barely recognized. "Yes," she managed, her throat tight. "I have a proposition for you." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or profound weariness, crossed his face before it was gone. "I'm not for sale." The dismissal was quiet but absolute. "No," Avery said, forcing herself to stand taller, to meet his impenetrable gaze. "I'm not buying. I'm offering. I need you to marry me." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and electric. The bartender, polishing a glass nearby, froze for a fraction of a second. The man just watched her, his expression unchanged. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. The silence stretched, becoming its own form of pressure. He was waiting for her to break, to laugh it off as a joke. She did not. "Why?" he asked finally, the single word a demand for the entire truth. "Because in 30 minutes, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, "my father is going to announce my engagement to a man I have never met, for a business deal I want no part of. Because my entire life has been a transaction, and I want, for once, to make a choice that is entirely my own, even if it's the wrong 1 inch." He considered this, his gaze never leaving her face. He was reading her, she realized, not just her words but the terror and defiance warring within her. "And what do you know about me?" he asked. "Nothing," she admitted. "That's the point. You're a stranger. You have no connection to my world. You are my escape. You assume I want to be an escape," he countered, his voice flat. "Everyone wants something," she replied, a desperate gamble. "What do you want?" He was silent for a long moment, his eyes drifting back to the city lights. When he looked at her again, the fortress around his eyes seemed to have a crack in it, a brief glimpse of a shared exhaustion. "Freedom," he said, the word so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "From what?" she dared to ask. He gave a small, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The same thing you want freedom from." A world of transactions, he held her gaze. "You do this, you ruin your father's plans. What do I get?" "My silence. My discretion. A wife on paper who will ask for nothing. When you want an annulment, a divorce, you will have it without a fight," she promised. He nodded slowly, a decision settling behind his eyes. All right, the single word was so anticlimactic it stole her breath. He stood up, placing a few crisp bills on the counter. "We should go now, before your father makes his announcement." The city clerk's office was a universe away from the Skyview Lounge. Here, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee, and the lighting was a merciless, buzzing fluorescent that bleached all the color from the world. It was a place of sterile beginnings and endings, devoid of all ceremony. Avery stood beside the stranger, whose name she now knew was Minjun, and stared at the peeling paint on the wall. The gravity of her actions was beginning to press down on her, a physical weight in her chest. This was real. The forms they had filled out in neat, block letters felt like confessions. Name. Date of birth. Place of residence. His was an address in an older, unfamiliar district of Seoul. Hers was the American Embassy compound, a detail that had made the clerk raise a skeptical eyebrow. Now, they stood before a tired-looking official who droned on in Korean, the words washing over Avery in a meaningless tide. Minjun responded in quiet, respectful tones, his voice a low counterpoint to the official's monotone. He nudged a document toward her, pointing to a line. "Sign here," he instructed softly. Her hand trembled as she took the pen. The signature was barely legible, a frantic scrawl of ink that looked nothing like her own. It was the signature of a different person, a reckless girl she had just become. The official stamped the paper with a loud, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room. It was done. They were married. There were no flowers, no music, no loving vows. There was only the stark, legal finality of a government stamp. Min-jun produced a small, plain box from his pocket. Inside were two simple bands of white gold. They were unadorned, without inscription or flourish. He took one and slid it onto her finger. The metal was cool against her skin. It felt foreign and heavy, a shackle. She did the same for him, her fingers brushing against his. His hand was steady and warm, a startling contrast to the cold dread coiling in her stomach. They were pronounced husband and wife in a language she didn't understand, and then dismissed with a perfunctory nod. They walked out of the building and into the biting winter air, the sky now a deep, starless black. The city's noise seemed distant. A bubble of surreal silence enveloped them. "My father will have discovered I'm gone by now," Avery said, her voice thin. "He will look for me," Min-jun nodded, his gaze sweeping the street as if assessing for threats. "He will not find you." It wasn't a reassurance, it was a statement of fact. He led her to a nondescript black car parked down the block, opening the passenger door for her. As she slid inside, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall, melting against the dark windshield like fleeting, forgotten tears. She had done it. She had detonated her life. And now, she was driving into the unknown with a man whose last name she had only just learned, a man who is now, inexplicably, her husband. The car moved silently through the labyrinthine streets of Seoul, leaving the glittering, modern towers of Gangnam behind and venturing into a part of the city that seemed to breathe a different, older air. They drove through narrow alleyways where the neon signs gave way to the soft, warm glow of paper lanterns. The snow was falling more heavily now, muffling the sounds of the city and cloaking the world in a blanket of quiet white. Avery had expected a sterile high-rise apartment, a bachelor pad of chrome and glass. Instead, the car stopped before a high, unassuming stone wall, broken only by a heavy, dark wooden gate. Min-jun killed the engine, and the silence that descended was profound. He led her to the gate, which opened with a soft click, revealing not a building, but a courtyard. It was a hanok, a traditional Korean house, its elegant, curved tile roof dusted with a fine layer of fresh snow. A single stone path wound through a meticulously kept garden, now dormant for the winter, toward the main house. The warm light spilling from the paper-lined doors felt like a beacon in the cold night. The house was a paradox. It was in the heart of one of the world's most bustling metropolises, yet it felt as secluded and peaceful as a mountain temple. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of cedarwood and brewing tea. The design was minimalist, all clean lines, dark wood, and pale walls. There were no flashy displays of wealth, no art meant to impress. Every object, a ceramic vase, a stack of books, a simple ink-wash painting on the wall, felt chosen with immense care and purpose. It was a space that valued tranquility over opulence. "This is your room," Min-jun said, sliding open a door to reveal a spacious chamber. A simple, low bed was neatly made, and a window looked out onto a smaller, private inner garden where a single, snow-covered persimmon tree stood stoically. "The kitchen is through there. Feel free to use anything you need." He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant, a man accustomed to giving orders now navigating the strange, uncharted territory of domesticity. He was treating her like a guest, a fragile one at that. "Thank you," Avery whispered, the words feeling inadequate. She stepped into the room, the polished wood floor cool beneath her feet. He lingered in the doorway for a moment. "My room is at the other end of the hall," he said, the statement a quiet establishment of boundaries. "If you need anything, he trailed off. "Good night, Avery." He slid the door shut, leaving her alone in the silent, beautiful house. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the simple gold band on her finger catching the soft light. This was her new home. This tranquil sanctuary was the domain of the man she had picked at random, a man whose quiet intensity hinted at a life far more complex than she could imagine. She had escaped one prison only to walk willingly into another, albeit a much more beautiful one. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the soft, whispering sound of the falling snow. The days that followed bled into one another, each marked by the same quiet, formal rhythm. Avery and Minjun were two ghosts haunting the same beautiful, silent house. They orbited each other with a careful, polite distance, their lives running on parallel tracks that rarely intersected. He would be gone before she woke, leaving only the lingering scent of coffee in the air. A tray would be left for her on the kitchen counter, fresh fruit, pastries, and a thermos of hot barley tea. It was a gesture of a caretaker, not a husband. She would spend her days exploring the hanok, which was larger than she first thought, a series of interconnected buildings and hidden courtyards. It was a labyrinth of serene beauty, each room a study in minimalist elegance. Yet it felt empty, a museum of a life rather than a home. She found a study, a room lined with books in Korean and English, ranging from classical philosophy to modern economics. There was no clutter, no personal photographs, only a profound sense of order and discipline. She would often find him there late at night, sitting in the dark, bathed in the blue glow of a laptop screen, the picture of perfect, lonely control. Sometimes, their paths would cross in the evening. They would share a meal, often prepared by a silent, efficient housekeeper who came and went like a phantom. Their conversations were stilted, filled with polite inquiries about her day. "Did you find everything you needed?" he would ask. "Yes, thank you," she would reply. "The house is beautiful," he would simply nod, his expression unreadable. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his presence. She learned the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floors, the quiet way he closed a door, the almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw when he was preoccupied. He was a man composed of layers of discipline and restraint, and she found herself becoming fascinated by what lay beneath the surface. One evening, she found him in the main courtyard, staring up at the bare branches of the ginkgo tree. Snow was beginning to fall again, tiny, hesitant flakes in the twilight. "It's a lonely house," she said, her voice soft, not wanting to startle him. He turned his head, his dark eyes watching her approach. "It was built for a family," he said, his voice laced with a melancholy she had never heard before. "It has been empty for a long time, and now it has you," she offered. He looked at her then, a real, searching look. "And you," he added quietly. In that moment, under the falling snow, the space between them felt smaller. The polite distance was still there, but it was now threaded with a fragile strand of shared solitude. The transaction was beginning to feel like something else, something more complicated and unnervingly human. They were not husband and wife, but they were no longer complete strangers. They were two lonely people in a lonely house, slowly, cautiously, learning the shape of each other's silence. Avery began to venture out of the hanok, testing the boundaries of her new, unstructured freedom. At first, she stayed within the quiet, winding streets of the Buckshin neighborhood, where the traditional houses stood in silent defiance of the sprawling modernity just beyond the hills. She would wander through the alleys, watching steam rise from food stalls and listening to the distant, melodic chime of a temple bell. The anonymity was intoxicating. For the first time in her life, no one knew her as Ambassador Davies' daughter. She was just a foreign woman in a dark coat, a nameless face in the crowd. Emboldened, she started taking the subway, losing herself in the vast, pulsing veins of the city. She explored the bustling markets of Namdaemun and the trendy, art-filled streets of Hongdae. Seoul was a city of startling contrasts. Ancient palaces nestled beside gleaming skyscrapers, serene temples just steps away from chaotic, neon-lit nightlife. She was beginning to fall in love with its energy, its resilience, its soul. It was during these excursions that she started seeing the name, Kianma Group. It was everywhere, emblazoned on the sides of sleek office towers that pierced the winter sky, on the logos of construction sites promising an even more futuristic skyline, on the branding of the ubiquitous telecommunications company that connected the entire nation. Kianma was not just a company, it was an empire, its insignia a stylized Pegasus that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of the city. She thought little of it, other than to marvel at its sheer scale. It was another facet of the world she had fled, a world of corporate power and monolithic influence, and she felt a smug satisfaction that it had nothing to do with her. Her life was now the quiet hanok, the simple meals, the silent man who shared her solitude. One afternoon, sitting in a small cafe, she overheard two businessmen at the next table speaking in hushed, reverent English. "The deal is dead without the chairman's approval," one said, stirring his coffee with a frantic energy. "And no one gets to the chairman. They say he hasn't been seen in public for weeks," the other added. "The old guard is running things, but everyone knows the real power is with him. The ghost of Kyanma inherited the whole damn thing, the clean and the dirty." Avery listened with mild interest, the conversation a familiar echo of her father's world. She paid for her tea and stepped back out into the cold, pulling her coat tight. As she walked toward the subway station, she passed a massive, state-of-the-art digital billboard. The Kyanma Group logo flashed across it, followed by a montage of their achievements: gleaming buildings, advanced technology, smiling families. It represented a world of power so immense it was abstract, a force of nature like the wind or the tide. She felt a profound sense of relief that she was so far removed from it, happily ignorant in her quiet, snow-dusted corner of the city, married to a simple, solitary man named Minjun. The inevitable storm broke on a frigid Thursday morning. Avery was arranging a few winter blossoms in a vase when the house's intercom chimed, a harsh, unfamiliar sound in the tranquil space. A moment later, Minjun appeared from his study, his face a mask of cold composure. "Your father is here," he said, the words clipped and devoid of emotion. Avery's blood ran cold. She had known this day would come, but she was not prepared. She followed Minjun to the main entrance, her hands trembling. Ambassador Davies stood in the courtyard, his large frame and expensive overcoat an aggressive intrusion into the serenity of the hanok. He was flanked by two severe-looking men who were clearly his security detail. His face was a thundercloud of fury. "Avery," he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "This foolishness ends now. You will come home. This is my home," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She felt Minjun's presence beside her, a silent, solid wall. Her father's gaze shifted to Minjun, his eyes filled with contemptuous dismissal. "And you," he sneered. "I don't know what gutter you crawled out of or how much she paid you for this little stunt, but it's over. My lawyers will have this sham of a marriage annulled by noon." Minjun remained perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He met the ambassador's glare with an unnerving calm. "There will be no annulment," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made the air crackle. "She is my wife," the ambassador laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Your wife? Do you have any idea who I am? I can crush a man like you without a second thought. I can have you deported, arrested, buried in so much legal trouble you'll never see the light of day." Minjun took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ambassador Davies," he began, his tone deceptively mild. "Your company, Davies International, has spent the last 6 months desperately trying to secure a partnership for the Incheon Port Expansion Project. A project, I believe, that is critical for your third-quarter projections." Her father's blustering faltered. "What do you know about that?" "I know that the final decision rests with the primary stakeholder," Minjun continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A conglomerate that owns the port, the construction firms, and the shipping logistics company you so desperately wish to partner with." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the cold air. "A company called the Kyanma Group." Avery's heart stopped. The name, the logo, the ghost chairman. It all slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The ambassador's face had gone pale, a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. "My name," Minjun said, his dark eyes like chips of ice, "is Kang Minjun. And the final decision for your port expansion rests with me. So I ask you, Ambassador, will you be having tea? Or will you be leaving my home?" Her father stared, speechless, not at a small-time gangster, but at the silent, invisible king who owned the very ground he was standing on. After her father and his men retreated, their arrogant bluster replaced by a stunned, humiliating silence, the courtyard fell quiet again. The only sound was the wind whispering through the bare branches of the ginkgo tree. Avery felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. The man standing beside her was the same man who left tea for her in the mornings, the same man who sat in quiet solitude in his study. But he was also someone else entirely, a figure of unimaginable power. She turned to face him, her mind reeling with betrayal and confusion. "You lied to me," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. "You let me believe you were." "Nobody, I never lied," Minjun countered, his own voice strained, the mask of composure finally cracking. "You never asked. You said you wanted a stranger." "I was a stranger, she cried, her voice rising. "You're not a stranger. You're an institution. The Kiyama Group? You own half of this city. Is this just another cage, Minjun? A bigger, more beautiful cage than the one I left?" The pain in her accusation hung between them. He flinched, his gaze dropping to the frozen ground. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a cage. My cage." He looked up at her then, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the burden he carried. The fortress around his eyes was gone, and in its place was a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. "My father built an empire, part of it legitimate, part of it not. When he died, it became mine. The business, the name, the obligations, the enemies. I was 22 years old. I was told who to meet, who to trust, who I would have to marry to secure an alliance or neutralize a threat. My life was a series of transactions, just like yours." He took a hesitant step closer. "That night, in that bar, I was supposed to be meeting the daughter of a rival family. The final step in a merger that would have felt more like a prison sentence. And then I saw you. You looked at me, and I saw the same desperation I felt every single morning when I woke up. The same desire to set the whole world on fire just to feel free for a single moment." His confession settled over her, extinguishing her anger and leaving a raw, aching vulnerability in its place. He wasn't her captor. He was her reflection. Two prisoners who had, by a stroke of cosmic irony, found the key to each other's cells. He slowly reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was hesitant, as if he were afraid she might break. "Marrying you, Avery," he murmured, his thumb stroking her skin, "was the first choice I ever made that was entirely my own." The space between them disappeared. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was tender and heartbreakingly soft, a silent acknowledgement of their shared scars, a promise made in the quiet courtyard that they would no longer be alone in their gilded cages. The revelation did not solve everything, but it changed the foundation of their world. The polite silence that had once filled the hanok was replaced by a tentative, fragile honesty. They started talking, truly talking, in the late hours of the night when the city outside was asleep and the house felt like their own private universe. Avery told him about her suffocating childhood, the constant pressure to be the perfect diplomat's daughter, a polished asset to be admired and, eventually, traded. Minjun spoke of his own gilded prison, of inheriting a legacy steeped in both brilliance and darkness, of the crushing loneliness that came with being at the apex of power, where every relationship was suspect and every motive was questioned. They discovered they were fluent in the same language of solitude. The house itself began to feel different. It was no longer a beautiful museum but a home, its warmth emanating not just from the heated floors but from the slow, steady blossoming of their connection. Avery found herself seeking out his company, no longer content to orbit him from a distance. She would bring him tea in his study, and he would stop his work, his eyes softening when she entered the room. He started coming home earlier, the lure of their shared quiet stronger than the demands of his empire. One snowy evening, he led her to a part of the house she had never seen, a small room that housed a state-of-the-art telescope. He opened the roof's observatory slit to the clear, cold winter sky. "My father taught me the constellations here," he said, his voice laced with a complex mix of grief and affection. "He said that up there are no borders, no corporations, no enemies. Just order and light." He guided her to the eyepiece, his hand resting gently on the small of her back, a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. He pointed out Orion and the Pleiades, his voice a low murmur against her ear. The city, his city, felt a million miles away. Later that night, sitting by the low fire in the main room, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The simple gold band on her finger no longer felt like a shackle but a link, a tangible symbol of the unlikely bond they had forged. "I didn't intend for you to be trapped in my world," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I only wanted to be free in yours, even for a little while." Avery squeezed his hand. "We were never in different worlds, Min-jun," she whispered. "We were just in different cells of the same prison." He turned to look at her, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face, and the love she saw in his eyes was as vast and as real as the constellations above them. It was a love born not in a fairy tale, but in an act of mutual rebellion, a quiet, desperate alliance that had somehow become their salvation. They had found their freedom not by escaping, but by choosing to be imprisoned together. And in the heart of Seoul, in the silent, snow-covered hanok, their shared cage had finally, miraculously, become a sanctuary.